introduction to our guest this evening, Chris Widger, who's had a very distinguished record managing the countryside properties of the National Trust right across Cheshire, with all of the diversity that involves, all of the really complex and challenging interactions with people. When you're deciding that you're going to manage a heathland on an Iron Age hill fort in Peckforton, and that involves clearing lots of birch trees, you're going to find yourself in quite a challenging place. And Chris has handled all of this with great tact and diplomacy, but always really putting nature first in trying to find the best outcome. We were so delighted when Chris, having moved on in his career and now operating as a consultant in his own right, decided that he actually had some space and time to contribute to our local area through Transition Wilmslow. And in an earlier meeting of the Tree and Woodland group, Chris presented his thoughts about the tree and woodland, a tree and woodland strategy for our local area. And this is very timely because Cheshire East for a long time has been an outlier in terms of community forestry in northwest England. But in the last year, it became part of the formal partnership with other local authorities in the Mersey Belt and joined the Mersey Forest Partnership. So in a sense, what Chris is going to talk about is very, very timely and gives us a really good setting on the one hand for thinking forward for a new period of growth and development for the tree group itself in Transition Wilmslow, but also for thinking about how we will relate to the wider Northern Forest Initiative. And Paul Nolan, who is the director of the Mersey Forest, is going to talk about that next week. So this is the perfect primer really for that conversation. So Chris, we're so delighted. And we felt when we initially heard Chris give a presentation along these lines to the tree group, that this deserved a much wider audience. And therefore we're delighted that Pippa and Stuart agreed to include this in the Festival of Nature. Over to you.
Yes, over to you, Chris, and do share your screen with us, please.
Would you like us all to mute, Stuart?
Can you see a slide there?
Yes, we can, thanks.
I'm just going to move you all because you're in the way of it. Well, John, thank you very much for your very kind words, actually. Yes, and it certainly is the case that trees, I wouldn't have believed this 30 years ago, but trees can be incredibly contentious things. Woodlands can be contentious. I guess I've heard Chris Franklin use this phrase on many occasions. It's all about the right tree in the right place, and I think that's probably something that we should try to recall when we're thinking about development and enhancement of trees and woodlands in our landscape here. Anyway, well, I'm not quite sure how I ended up here. I think, but I would like to say thank you very much for inviting me along. I think it was at the original the showing of this presentation that I sort of went through why I felt we needed a strategy. This came off the back of a request from our previous chairman, Jonathan, who asked me initially whether I would be prepared to be a liaison person, if that's the right phrase, with the Northern Forest. And I said, well, yeah, that's great, but what do I talk about? What do we want? What are we saying to them? How do we take any conversations forward, and what is the context? And we drew a bit of a blank at that. So I said, well, probably what we could do with not just to aid those sorts of conversations. But in order for the group to understand what it's all about and what it's trying to achieve, we could do with something of a strategic plan. So I said, I'll have a go at putting together what I feel one should look like and just draft out the main key points rather than create the whole document at this stage, and just see what that might look like. And so that's really how the initial presentation came about to the Tree and Woodland group. And hence here we are today, really, hoping that, I guess that the concept of a tree and woodland strategy could be something that might be endorsed by Transition Wilmslow more widely, and that we can, so to speak, adopt and set about preparing. John's done the intro bits for me, so I won't go any further with that. Thank you, John. So really, I guess, you know, my key questions are what should it look like? Why do we want one? And how do we actually deliver it? How do we put it together? And I'm hoping to sort of cover those points really in the next, I'm hoping to do that in about half an hour or so. And given that there's a sort of modest number of people, I'm not sure how you want to handle this, whether you want to throw questions in as we go along or whether we wait till the end. I'm not sure. I don't really have any strong views on that, I guess.
Chris, it's up to you. I mean, if someone has I'll keep an eye on the hands going. If someone wants to interrupt Chris, I'll let him know, and then he can address the individual who can take the mute off. So do that. But otherwise, if we don't hear to the contrary, we'll all have a jolly good grilling of Chris at the end.
Okay. So effectively, what I aim to cover this evening is a little bit about what we already know in terms of, you know, the tree and woodland resource that we have in the area, and some of the work that we're already doing to help support, I guess, the enhancement of those resources. And I look at a little bit about what more we might need and why we need it and how we might use a strategy before finally thinking about how we actually develop it. I pinched this slide from, well, much of the slide, I think, from a presentation that John presented himself some time back. And I think before we go any further, I think we need to just remind ourselves why trees matter. I mean, there's an incredible list of benefits there that really, you know, go without saying, I think, support the quality of life in an area like this and in any area through various sort of physical and social sort of benefits. And yeah, just picking up on what John said, really, this is in a way a follow-on from a presentation that he gave to the Tree and Woodland group a little while back. But I didn't want to undertake this presentation without recognizing the fact that he's the guy who really got us thinking about this, I think, and asked a few questions really about where we might go with this. And this is perhaps where I'm picking up from something that he's already started. His objectives were these: to look at how trees and woodlands relate to the Wilmslow landscape character areas, and examine the cover across the town and the area, and review the potential for doubling tree cover. These were some of his aspirations. And if we feel that those are relevant, then I think we need to retain those points. But we do need to find a way to try to crystallize the objectives and in order that we can develop some plans to do that. So here we go. There's a little bit of context for trees in our area. And you can see just by that aerial shot, actually, of the town centre that, you know, we're well endowed with trees. And I think John has described this as a savanna landscape. I'm not quite sure Wilmslow in this context looks like a savanna, but you get the picture, don't you, in the sort of middle and far distance of that spread of tree canopy. there are a lot of trees, but there are issues around trees as well. I think we'll come on to that. So just as a reminder, you may well have seen this, this map, but these are the Wilmslow landscape character areas from the landscape character assessment that John and others worked on. And this map shows the density of trees across the town. And I think if I go backwards, you'll see that in the middle there, you've got the more urbanized parts of the town, and you can see the River Bollin corridor running sort of roughly east-west through the middle of it. You can see how the dark blue areas, which is where we have more trees than others, is really focused in the middle part of the town, really along the Bollin corridor. Elsewhere, far fewer trees, and actually over to the southeast, you can see that there's very few. We benefit from having some really, really good quality maps, which show very specific locations to trees. And again, these sort of largely, these are specific trees plotted on a map. And you can see again that very largely they're following linear features, the river across the middle, as well as the River Dean tributary and the railway and the road networks. And trees very, by and large, focus on those sort of linear features. And that's just a blown up section, which sort of just make that point, I think. That's the cars in Wilmslow Park passing through the middle of the town. And this map shows trees on streets. The darker blue color is where the greater concentrations of trees are. The lighter, I'm not quite sure whether it's green or yellow, but the lighter colors are where we have fewer trees along trees. And this looks a little bit more patchy, I feel. But it just goes to suggest that perhaps there's an opportunity to enhance street tree numbers where we see the lighter colors. Now, I think John mentioned a number of issues, and I'd concur that these are significant for us. We see land use change. The town is urbanizing. We are seeing peripheral farms disappear. We're seeing farmland being sold off for development and moving away from agriculture into more sort of municipal and urbanized and horsey sort of type landscapes, which of course has an impact on biodiversity and landscape more broadly, as well as the tree cover. We're seeing development intruding into river valleys, which impacts on, again, on character, biodiversity, and increased the levels of light pollution into those otherwise fairly good quality habitats. And generally speaking, housing development is squeezing landscape. And as John also pointed out, though Lindo Common is designated, we do lack designations broadly speaking. And of course, Lindo more broadly is not designated. And we all know the potential for threat there. So in terms of opportunities, I think there are many. We should be trying to work with policymakers, I think. And by that, I mean the planners, in order to try and influence through the sort of planning systems. I guess we ought to be in a position to perhaps use that policy and apply it where we feel that perhaps it's worthwhile, where maybe we have an opportunity to challenge what we see as inappropriate development that might compromise our tree and woodland cover. I think this opportunity to work with partners around connectivity. We do have a lot of National Trust land within the area. We have a lot of Cheshire East council-owned land, and who knows, potentially farmers, if we just have the right conversations, might be prepared to partner up as well. And so I think much of our success, if we are to achieve an enhancement in woodland cover, is reliant upon working with partners and in a sort of formalized productive partnership arrangements, which of course can lead to the potential for generating funding. Very difficult, much more difficult, I think, doing these things alone. And of course, once you've got partnerships in place, then, and potentially funding, you could start to think about developing projects which actually get the work done. And maybe there's an opportunity for notifying landscapes as well, and achieving designations, although I think that's a big challenge, but it could be an aspiration. This map, I think is quite an interesting one. It shows, again, the sort of green spaces and networks of biodiversity. You can see again that the river valley features heavily, but there's also an awful lot of opportunity elsewhere where we do have quite significant green spaces and we do have linkages. So this map also shows TPOs, the little green circles, are trees with preservation orders applied to them. So looking at a map of that sort, I think it sort of starts to suggest where, you know, in terms of mapping, you could start to think about enhancement of those features and start to think about linkages and increasing areas and so on. And we aren't without a framework within which to work. There are a series of local plan strategy policies that I think help us. I've listed a few there that I've spotted within the local plan, which I think all advocate green, improvements in green infrastructure, including, and that implies trees and woodlands. And there are some policies very specifically about trees and hedgerows, etc. So I think, that's a good start. There is the local council environment strategy as well, which, has aspirations around carbon neutrality, improving air quality, sustainable development, and it refers to using Section 106 agreement funds to generate green infrastructure projects. So these again could be opportunities where we are seeing development to try to tease out of the local authority agreement funds that might allow real initiatives to take place, which actually meet their own objectives. And then there's the local neighbourhood plan policies as well, which some of you will know very well, if not all of you, which again support enhancement of the green infrastructure and the networks that we have. And even initiatives such as this one, you may recognise this as the cars. This is a map taken, just a quick screenshot from the plan for the cars, the master plan, which is looking great, I think. That's just one page from quite a large document. If you haven't seen that, it's worth a look. It's on the Cheshire East website, which again, is advocating enhancement of tree canopy. So we have a framework, even on a local scale in some areas. And we do have examples of where I have worked in a partnership to do work of this type, to try and influence policy. I was involved whilst working for the National Trust with Cheshire East in a partnership around trying to influence decision-making and incorporating landscape into the planning policy. So a landscape spirit of place, I should say, really. This is about a National Trust concept, really, about the spirit of a place and trying to evaluate what that might mean for people who live in that landscape, and bringing about responses to those questions, and influencing planning policy. And that is something that has been adopted by Cheshire East, which again is something of an example, and also perhaps a frame, supportive framework in which to work. This is just a little bit of detail about how I went through that, looking at evaluation of the heritage of the area and its landscape and nature and wildlife, and the socio and social economic characteristics of the area, and then trying to bring about a statement of significance for the landscape from that study. That map just shows one case study area, where I looked at how we might actually put that into practice. So I do have an example of how that might, that sort of partnership work might be taken forward across at least a relatively modest landscape. And of course, we have a resource in the people. This is the Transition Wilmslow Tree and Woodland Group, 2 or 3 years back, making a start on thinking about this. And I think it's possibly off the back of this gathering that John's talk initially took place, I suspect. I wasn't part of the group at that time. But we do have, we have skills and we have knowledge and a desire to make a positive change amongst us. So I think, we do have some useful resources with which to work. I didn't want to overlook the fact that the Tree and Woodland Group, though it may think it needs a strategy and it might help, we're not sort of passive. We are trying to get things done nonetheless, even without a strategic sort of plan. And these are some examples of initiatives that are up and running or is sort of taking place or even have taken place. So one of the major ones we're looking at is working with Ansa across the parks and green spaces in Wilmslow. And I'll show you some maps and proposals for some of those. In fact, some of you may have even seen some planting in some of the green spaces already, and some of the parks in Wilmslow. We have a little black poplar project up and running, as well as a number of others in partnership as well, some of them. So I didn't want to sort of imply really that we're sitting on our hands looking at drafting up a document whilst doing nothing practical. We are doing some stuff. What did I include that one for? Can't remember. Actually, that's just a map. I think that the group put together after that initial meeting, looking at suggested locations for planting, which again really sort of qualifies some of what we were saying earlier. But I'll move on. These are the playgrounds and open spaces within the town. I think there are 11 that are recognised, and largely these are managed by Ansa. Not all of them, but mostly by Ansa, which is the local authority arm's length sort of contractor. And well, actually, Jonathan, to give him his due, he really struck up a very productive relationship with Ansa, and I think we've benefited from that relationship in terms of some work already having been put into place. This is an area at Houghty Close, adjacent to a piece of woodland called Oaken Clough, Coleshaw, and you can see the photo on the left shows a pretty featureless grass area, which I suspect is mown pretty frequently, using up lots of contractor time, lots of fuel, emitting lots of carbon, and not really doing anyone any favors. And the little map to the right of that shows a proposal for extending that woodland and creating further planting, which is sort of blending both I suppose a natural approach to woodland planting and a more formalized one along the footpath. The green on that right-hand maps is a suggested extension to that woodland. And we were proposing that the extension should really take the form of a sort of structurally diverse woodland edge. So it should be graduated and create much greater opportunity for wildlife. You'll note that in the photograph, the edge of the woodland is really rather abrupt. And in I suppose in generic terms, it's rather unnatural. It's too abrupt and not as beneficial as it might be to wildlife and habitat. So a structural edge like that will produce much more opportunity for a wider array of wildlife. And we look at, I don't expect you to read all the numbers, but we look at the way in which we might then propose species which create that woodland, graduated woodland edge. So the colours almost represent the way in which on the left-hand side you've got the taller canopy maiden type trees, and down on the right in the bluer colour you've got species which are more shrub-like. So the orange is the sort of stuff in between. So yeah, a planting regime which supports that graduated woodland edge. And this is the sort of stuff that we found ourselves thinking about when developing some of these projects. And some further maps of areas within Wilmslow. This is South Oak Lane in Fulshore and then the Carnival Fields, and some proposals there for planting, some of which I think have been undertaken. Unfortunately, I don't have any photographs. I can't think why I haven't got them. I think Jonathan took lots, and I've seen them, but I don't think I have copies of them, unfortunately. But anyway, and examples of some of the plans that we've been putting together in order to draft up proposals with Ansa. And this is another example at Coleshall Drive, just the type of thing that we look at. We're not trying to sort of, I suppose, cover the whole of these sites with trees, but to offer proposals which enhance what we have, to complement the existing cover, but also take reference to the use of that area and how aesthetically that might also fit with what's there. This is a map of an area at Land Lane. Just if you don't know where that is, it's if you go up bypass in a southerly direction to the high school and turn left towards Prestbury, it's just on the right, next to the allotments there. And this is a little proposal for trees there. And that's a photograph you might have seen before as well in another talk by Althea, because she took this, of me planting a hedgerow with some, I think they're beavers, the smallest of the scout groups. That's it, beavers? Cubs, beavers, one or the other. And then there's our attempt to, well, save an endangered species, really. This is us planting one of, can't quite remember how many we planted, but John will know. You're on mute, John. How many? 5, 10? I can't see your hands. Sorry.
John, do you want to just unmute and answer that one?
7.
7, thank you. We planted 7 native black poplars just on near Whitehall Brook, just on basically by the roundabout at the end of Wilmslow bypass, and they're tucked away behind the embankment there. If you weren't aware of this, the native black poplar is considered to perhaps be Britain's most endangered tree species. It has the ability to hybridize with all sorts of other poplars, and therefore the true genetic strain is threatened. And it's thought that of the 4,000 or 5,000 in the country, there may be 300 in our area. So we're quite well endowed with them, and they tend not to exist much further north than this, not much further north. So we're doing our bit to try and perpetuate that species. Chester Zoo have a program of propagation. So they're a source for us, and I know the National Trust use them as well. I think the Wildlife Trust might also. One of the big questions I think I have around a woodland strategy for Wilmslow is whether or not we consider Handforth as part of that. I was commissioned last year by Handforth Parish Council then to draft a woodland strategy. It's more of a woodland management plan actually for the woodlands that were identified in the Handforth neighbourhood plan, and so that exists, and there is a plan for those woodlands, which, and I don't see why, you know, a strategy really for our area shouldn't take account of that at the very least, and perhaps incorporate it and think about building upon it. I don't know if any of you have heard of a Professor Lawton who drafted a State of Nature report on behalf of the government a few years back. And one of the key phrases that he uses that always sticks with me around considerations when thinking about development of habitat is, and the threat to wildlife more broadly, is that if you're going to do something, you should do it bigger, you should do it better, and you should try to join it up. And I think, therefore, if you take account of those sentiments, then perhaps we should be considering our neighbours in Handforth and incorporating a strategy for the whole of the area. But that's perhaps open for debate. And just for your interest, those are the 12 woodland compartments. And in large respect, around 50% of them are owned by Cheshire East. So again, there is that potential to perhaps implement some positive change by working in partnership with the local authority. Who knows? So if we do have a strategy, how does it help? Well, personally, I think any good strategy should have something of a vision at the start. And I think, you know, it could help inform and guide, if nothing else, the tree and woodland group. And we can, you know, there's a case in point now. Paddy is taking over from Jonathan as of really effectively this week. So, you know, a document of this sort can see through personnel changes in the group. So I think from that point alone, it would probably be a good idea. But it helps enable development of objectives. I think it helps, a strategy would help raise awareness of what we're trying to do more broadly in the community and perhaps with stakeholders. We start then to think about themes and opportunities. And we also provide ourselves with a framework for developing initiatives. And I think very importantly, we start to think about how we identify the stakeholders with whom we need to work. And a strategic document, I think, is important from their point of view, because otherwise it's very difficult for those people to understand exactly what we're all about. And it also helps with potential for funding. If we have something that can be seen to be a worthwhile objective that is presented to them in a documentary way, then that can generate those sorts of relationships which can bring forth funding. And I think if nothing else, it could also help the wider Transvision Wilmslow group in understanding what we are trying to do and to advocate what we do, and potentially generate further support in the community. This is a vision that I drafted for Handforth Woodlands. Don't really want you to read it all, but it does mention the Handforth Woodlands as being green lung. It mentions partnership with landowners. It mentions being accessible, woodlands being accessible and understood and valued. The word enjoyment comes up. Amenity and ecological contribution and quality of life for locals comes up. Diversity, veteran trees, resilience, These are all good words, I think. And it does reference protection made possible through local policies. So I think, you know, from my point of view, we do need to consider how we use the framework to make it work. So I guess if we are going to put together a strategy, we need to think about what a vision for the tree and woodland group in Wilmslow might look like. And again, this is just a starter for 10. I think it is time that we started to look at that, if we agree that this is to go forward, and what it should say in order to give us something to work from. I've just said the group will enable opportunities for the people of Wilmslow to plant and nurture more trees and care for those trees which already exist within the town and associated landscape. The group will facilitate new planting which complements and connects existing tree provision and habitats so that biodiversity, quality of life for residents, and resilience to the effects of climate change is enhanced. With some aims attached: more trees, managing existing trees, and potentially engaging the community in trees and woodland projects. I think it should have objectives, and again, I've thrown some in just for debate purposes, really. More street trees, improvements of connectivity, increased woodland cover, a street tree replacement program. I think it is very, very important that we recognise that though we do have a significant cover, street tree cover, especially along those blue sections that you might recall, there isn't a huge amount of replacement tree planting underway, and that's an issue. Enhancing quality of life and recreation through trees, engaging people, protecting our significant trees, cover, and so on. And if we are going to put one together, this is the sort of layout I imagined, you know, probably in line with most strategic plans, that it might look like. We'd have our introduction and set the scene and provide the context, and look at why the strategy is needed, along with that vision and our aims and objectives, and maybe objectives under sort of set of themes, perhaps street trees, trees in woodlands, parks, in areas of housing, and so on. And last but not least, I think very importantly, a plan of how we might hope to deliver some of this. It needs to be written, and I think that in sort of project governance sort of terms, the Tree and Woodland Group can act as a board, and the chairman should be the sponsor, guiding and working with a project manager to draft this document. So effectively, the project manager is answerable to that sponsor, but the board is I guess, that group of people to whom this is being delivered for. All a bit projecty, but I think it needs a framework again in which to be drafted. So at the end of all this, I guess I have a couple of key questions. You know, is this what we want? Do we need it? Does it help? And if so, what are the aims? And I think those are questions that perhaps, you know, we can take forward with the Tree and Woodland Group. Who should we work with? And again, very importantly, I think, what are we not trying to do? I guess we've got to be pragmatic and realistic. And are we a campaigning group around trees, or are we influencing policy? I think those again are questions that, you know, need to be thought about before we draft that piece of paper, that document. And the other question, of course, is the extent, the geographical extent. And do we sort of put a stranglehold on ourselves if we introduce targets? Is that realistic? Should we do that? Do we need one? going back to John's initial talk, he, I think, asked that question, could we double tree canopy cover in Wilmslow and Handforth by 2040 or 30? Well, I think it is an aspiration, but I suspect without some form of a plan or a strategic plan, it might be very difficult. And that's it. That's where I was going to finish. And that just, any guesses? I think I might have asked this question before. Any guesses as to where that is? It is a UK photograph. Just shows you how trees can play a significant part in a very urban area. I'll tell you. Is it
London? Is it London? Sorry, in London, Chris?
It is on the northern periphery of London. Does that give you any?
Watford?
Not quite that far out. No, it's Epping Forest.
Ah.
Yeah. Oh, it's an edge. It's the end of Epping Forest. Yeah. So yeah, it just shows you quite how significant a part that woodland plays in that area. And that's it.
Well, I think that's absolutely fantastic. Chris, as you've gone along, you've actually answered quite a lot of questions I might have asked you before you started. So that's excellent. We've also had some questions and comments on chat, which you won't have had opportunity to read. One of your questions to us in your talk was the geographical limits of any strategic plan. And Andrew pointed out that the Transition Wilmslow's Constitution does say that TW covers Wilmslow, Handforth, and the surrounding areas. So we've got quite a bit of scope there. Can I ask one of the other audience members to follow on from that? Has anyone got if you want to put your hand up and at the same time undo your mute? Anthony and Pippa?
Chris, I really enjoyed that talk. Brilliant. It changed my views in a lot of ways. I'm sure you're right. We need to be more strategic. As part of that, you talked about the woody area at Oakenclough and trying to bring in more sort of peripheral development to that. And I think the implication was planting those shrubs and things. I'm conscious the fact money is going to be tight and resources, etc. Do we always need to do that, or could we just stop mowing around it and let it rewild itself? And what about scrub in general? Because generally trees in urban areas everyone likes to keep everything neat and tidy around them. And whereas the real biodiversity happens if you let things happen naturally underneath those trees. And what's your sort of view of that aspect?
I think that's a really interesting question. I'd agree really that ideally in a perfect world, you'd let nature take its course. And I think that woodland would naturally regenerate into the peripheral areas on its own over time. I think there are a couple of factors to bear in mind. That it's currently a grassy area which is likely to be walked upon by many people, and that I think would have a bearing on the woodland's ability to spread naturally. Certainly, you'd have to stop mowing, obviously. Perhaps if you excluded people from an area, it would start to do that naturally. I think the oak trees and other trees in there. There's rowans and I can't remember what else. There's blackthorn and hawthorn, and they would all start to gradually self-seed themselves. And I think you would see that natural spreading of that woodland. I think in the meantime, the problem is that to the uninitiated, perhaps it would look like a mess, and it would look unkempt, and it would seem unmanaged, and I suspect draw the wrong type of attention. And I think in an urban context, that can be an issue. You might get away with it in a rural, quieter area, But here, I think we need to. I think it's a good idea to show people that we're trying to do something, and give it a head start. There is scope, I think, for allowing that natural regeneration to take place, and I think it could start to do that if you exclude an area and then plant it with a range of those trees, as I suggested. You don't have to fill the whole thing. You start it off. You show people that you're doing something. And I think it looks as if we've been proactive in the process and enabling the woodland to do its own thing after that. I think if you just left it, I think it would just get damaged.
Yeah, and possibly accumulate rubbish and stuff. Yeah.
Pepper, you want to come in on that?
Just on Sunday, we had a really nice tree walk with Chris Frankland, and we spent a lot of time basically around the leisure centre car park. And we started off in the bits that if you're coming out of the leisure centre, there's a little bit of car park, and then up to the right, there's a raised area that then drops straight down onto the road from the station, if you know where I mean.
Yeah.
And there's some really interesting trees in there, some big trees, some relics, presumably of the old rectory garden,
Okay. Yeah.
apple and dams and things like that. And then there's a separate area, which if you walk out of the leisure centre and turn to the left, you walk through there. And the difference between them was that in the raised area to the right, there is mowing. And in the other area, then there isn't any mowing. And Chris pointed out the remarkable difference. You feel as if you're walking on forest floor, you're walking on beech nuts, you're walking on a much richer earth, really. Whereas on the other side, where it's mown, it all looks a bit dry and you know, some of the grass is dead and so on, and yet people still walk through. And I guess because so many people walk, things don't grow that high, but you had a much better sense of a forest floor, and presumably the soil underneath was a lot healthier. So it's quite an interesting distinction just in one small urban area.
That's interesting. I haven't seen that. I'll have to have a walk over there. But I think allowing grasses to grow wherever you can is a great thing. I suspect in that particular area in that photograph that I showed, I would imagine that it's a fairly uniform sward. I don't suppose there's diversity. It was probably a municipal grass seed mix, largely ryegrass, I should imagine, which is a dominating grass. It takes a lot of nitrogen and suppresses other competing vegetation. And unless you reduce nitrogen levels, you won't get that competition, and you will not get the diversity. So stopping mowing is one thing, but I would advocate stopping the mowing during the growing season. At the end of the season, as you would with a hay meadow, you cut it and take it away. And gradually over time, if you do that every year, you reduce nitrogen levels and reduce fertility, and you enhance the opportunity for other species. So you create opportunity for diversity, and you get much more floristic interest. And throughout that of course does prevent you from creating woodland. So because otherwise you're going to be mowing your trees at the end of the summer. So I think you're going to have to find ways to incorporate grassland areas of that sort using that hay meadow type technique, mowing regime, with other areas that are planted. And I think that's what we were trying to achieve with, you know, some of the little plans that we've been drafting. So it's a blend.
Elaine, you've had your hand up for a little while. Would you like to come in?
Hi. I wondered whether people might be interested in was kind of a personal case study relating to street trees from, you know, somebody who's. So I live on one of the streets that was highlighted dark blue, although it might not be anymore, because since I've been here, there's at least half a dozen trees have been cut down, because I mean, they've been old and they've been just cut right down rather than pruned. And I was aware last year that there was a grant available that could be used towards tree planting. So I thought, right, well, maybe I can get organised. So I arranged with my neighbours who wanted new trees in front of, on the verge, and this is in the verges outside houses, and was connected to Jonathan, who seemed, because I wanted some advice, but because it was a private, you know, it wasn't part of the, well, I think there was some issue, there might be conflict with the council, what the tree group was doing. So I was kind of left to my own devices. I have a landscape gardener I've used in my own garden. So I said to him, can you give me some advice, and can you give me a quote for that I could use into a budget for applying for a grant? He was just too busy with his own work, so I never got the quotes, and the time went by. So basically there was an opportunity to replant, you know, with willing participation of half a dozen or so houses. You know, it's just kind of the end of Stile Road. And it just, I was just so frustrated because, you know, we couldn't make it happen. And I just didn't know. I didn't know who else to go to. I wanted to go to people that I could trust to give the right advice on what kind of trees, who could do the proper planting, because, you know, I just had shoulder operation. I wasn't going to be planting trees myself. So anyway, just to say, so absolutely supporting all of it, and you know, the need for more street trees. There's some absolutely fabulous street trees, but I was just case study of a private citizen trying to make change and failing utterly.
Elaine, it's not just the private. I'll come back to you in a second, Paddy. It's not just the private citizen. Wilmslow Civic Trust has been trying to move forward on various projects, and we find that Ansa say yes, it's a good idea, we'll do it, and then it never moves forward. So just flag that up, because, you know, I'd like to see some of the things that have already been agreed, like some planting in the Romany garden, like the planting of the Civic Trust Jubilee tree. We've ended up in the hands of Ansa, and we can't, even though we've got the funds to pay, we've got the budget, we've been told that we can't do it ourselves. We must let Ansa do it. So Ansa's become the hurdle to overcome. Paddy, you wanted to come in before we lose the thread.
Well, just very quick. I've literally got 2 minutes before I'm late for my inaugural meeting of the tree group, so I must be very quick. Elaine, the reason I got involved with the tree group was exactly the same problem that you've got. So I live on Broadwalk, and exactly the same as you, we have a really nice mature tree area, which in the time that I've been here has been halved in terms of the number of trees. And despite getting public opinion on our side, etc., we're continually blocked because you can't plant trees, or you're not meant to plant trees on someone else's land. Fundamentally, that's the problem. But now the tree group are trying to address that with CEC, and it's taking a long time, but we will get there. We will get the ability to work with the council, where we've got very positive groups who want to plant trees. So if I just park that, and we'll have to talk later about your area, because I'd love to get that as an example as well. And the one thing I wanted to say, Chris, because we need to do lots and lots of work with you on this, there's one thing I think wasn't particularly covered in the strategy, and that is that I think we have to galvanize public opinion. So when you talk to individuals in the town, you find an awful lot of people are incredibly enthusiastic, etc. We've got to remember there are a set of people who really like trees, but not near their house. Okay, and we have to address that somehow. We have to make that less socially acceptable, if you like, that people feel that actually I ought to do my bit. So I think the strategy, we need to think about that, because in turn, that will put more pressure on the council. And getting back to Elaine's problem, it will allow us to move forward. Because at present, the tree, it's a very frustrating existence, because there's an awful lot of people nodding, but not necessarily taking us forward. And I think the strategy has to take that on board, that we've got to win hearts and minds and make people, the general public, very frustrated by lack of activity. So with that thought, and people may disagree with it, so it's an ideal time for me to leave the thing. I must leave and go on.
Well, Paddy, thank you.
But the talk was excellent, Chris, and I'm very supportive of it. Okay.
Paddy, thank you for the open invitation for people to join you. What I suggest, because I think there's a lot of overlap, we're going to lose quite a few people in a moment to your meeting. I suggest that we just round off with a few more questions to Chris, and those that want to can join you perhaps part way through. But those that are going to the tree group, thank you for being with us thus far. And we will continue with a few more questions whilst you actually take some action and get things moving. So over to you. Continuing with the Festival of Nature, 8th of August, 8th of September meeting. Chris, we've got some, is Chris still there?
Yeah.
Oh, you are. Good, good.
Yeah.
It went a bit quiet. Chris, a couple of sort of botanical questions, really. Is clover, I'll roll them together and you can perhaps answer them together. Is something like clover leaf better than grass when people are sowing new pasture areas, or when we're looking at woodland areas on the perimeters of somewhere like the leisure centre? And the other question that came in, I think, from Beverly, is what type of trees are best for carbon storage, increasing less water? Now, I don't know whether that should be carbon storage and increasing less water, or is there an automatic link between carbon storage and increasing the reduction of water? And by water, I presume ground moisture. Chris, what do you think?
Well, firstly on clover, I'm not an ecologist, but I think clover is one of those plants that has the ability to take nitrogen out of the air and feed itself. And so farmers use it for enhancing the sort of fertility of soils in order that grasses within that sward are fed via the clover. And of course the cows can eat the clover, it's quite nutritious as well. So it's I think an agricultural approach to a grass sward, adding clover. It's very good from the point of view of a food source for invertebrates, birds, bees of course like it, lots of insects will feed on it. But I think if you were looking at a grassland mix, I probably wouldn't suggest it necessarily should be part of that, because as I was mentioning a little earlier, the higher the nutrient level, the higher the nitrogen level, the more likely that dominant grasses take over. And what you really need to do is try to reduce nitrogen levels. So although it's good from the point of view of a food source, and it can support grass growth from an agricultural point of view, I'm not sure I'd add it to a grassland mix, because it could defeat the object of that in terms of diversity a little bit. I think that's my understanding of it.
Well, the tree question, Beverly's just sent us a message to clarify that she meant trees that don't need as much water, i.e. are more drought tolerant.
Oh, I see. Sorry, the second
reference to water.
Yeah,
so
right,
the carbon favourable and drought tolerance.
Yeah. Well, in terms of carbon storage, of course, the bigger the better, and the longer lived the better. You know, all trees will store carbon. Some grow very quickly, but the ones that grow very quickly, which do gather a lot of carbon, also tend to be the ones that die more quickly. So things like, you know, a silver birch tree, very good at creating impact. It grows quite quickly, relatively quickly, but it also has a life expectancy of probably 70 or 80, 100 years at most. But if you plant an oak tree, then, you know, we all know that in the right conditions, that although it might take a while to get going, could exist for 300, 400, 500 years potentially. And that it really is locking carbon, lots of it for a long time. In terms of drought tolerance? That's a really good question. I think you need to look at where trees would exist naturally, and start from that premise. I think, you know, we do see a lot of beech trees in this area. We're really at the northern end of what is suitable for beech trees, and they do not like drought conditions, and they do not like really wet conditions. They don't tolerate the change from dry to wet conditions, and you'll see that in style. You'll see that in lots of the woodlands in this area, where trees will, Alderley Edge is a case in point, because the soils are very thin. They will die very, very quickly. Almost overnight, they will go, because they've just had too much drought that summer. And whereas deep-rooted trees like oak trees will tolerate that much more. No tree likes to have its roots wet permanently, other than perhaps one or two exceptions to that. But in the main, our broadleaf native species don't like to be wet all of the time, and they don't like to be dry all the time. And it's that change of climate that is the real issue. I think there are many trees that will tolerate drought, and there are many trees that will tolerate being wet. But it's the changing conditions that is the issue, and that is the problem I think we're seeing with climate change. It's not just that temperatures are getting warmer; they are, but our winters are getting wetter, and that is the issue. So again, it's around location. Up at the edge, at Alderley Edge, we're seeing trees die off very suddenly because there is very little soil there, and it dries out very quickly, and so trees will fail within the space of days or weeks because of that extreme climate change. So I'm not sure I've answered the question about which ones will tolerate drought, but I think if you go to Scotland, where trees are wet a lot of the time, Scots pine, birch trees, they'll tolerate water quite well. Willow trees love water. Alders like water. There are lots of trees that will cope with water, and a lot of it. And they will probably tolerate a reasonable amount of drought. But it's all about, I think, finding the right tree for the right location again, really.
I think that's fantastic. Whilst we're on a slightly botanical side, can I ask a question for myself? I think you just mentioned it in passing. Light pollution. Now, I'm particularly aware of that, living fairly close to the central Wilmslow and having beautiful trees. I'm aware quite often how late into the night I'm hearing birdsong. And I'm not talking about the owls, I regret, because I love to hear owls. I'm actually hearing hedge sparrows and other birds that should be roosting by the time I'm listening to them. So that's light pollution on animals. Does it have an effect on trees?
I'm afraid, Stuart, I'm not really sure I have an answer to that. I don't know. I would imagine, if a tree in its natural environment will go through a yearly cycle, as every organism does. And if you start to interfere with that cycle, there are bound to be consequences, I think. Of course, most of our trees, most of them are deciduous, so they are dormant in the winter and probably are little affected by the changes in conditions. But in the summer, they obviously need light. They are using light. I suspect they can tolerate a lot more. So I'm not sure. It's an interesting question. I don't know. I have an answer. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Now, have we any other questions before we let one or two other people perhaps join the tree group? Andrew, would you like to unmute and say a few words to round off the evening, and then I'll just mention the next events going forward.
Well, yes, thank you. It's a real pleasure to have Chris talking, He always has been a good talker, and it's really nice to hear him in action.
It's odd, Andrew, to be doing it on a Zoom. You know, I'm
I
used
know.
to.
I was going to say I wanted you in person. Really, you know, you're welcome to a meal anytime, Chris. As I thought, anyone would welcome Chris for a meal after that talk and things. So much to talk about, and I'm glad the tree group has got Paddy doing good things, because they have been doing, as you said, really good work, and I think it's great that you've been complimenting them too. Jonathan's been a star, and that it's just really good to have a slightly wider audience looking at this sort of thing, and thank you very much for coming along. I don't know how we do votes of thanks or anything like that in these sort of things.
We can unmute all of us, and we can jolly well applaud in English fashion.
Oh right, not on the other way. Yeah, thank you very much, Chris. Yeah,
Very much.
good.
Thank you again, Chris. Thank you all for attending. Next week, next Wednesday, we have Paul Nolan coming along, Director of the Mersey Forest, as was mentioned earlier. We have a fantastic programme during the Festival of Nature. So have a look at the website, www.festivalofnature.co.uk. So that's got full details. And the big event is Sunday, the 25th of September, when we're going to bring Wilmslow to a standstill and prove how it improves the air quality. So I look forward to seeing you all in person, wandering around, breathing clean air. Thank you again. Do join us on and off throughout the festival. Good night, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Good.